taken aback by the large number here. This is very good. This suggests we have a great interest in science fiction at Georgia Tech, or that we have people who just wanted a free lunch. That's good too at Georgia Tech. Anything free. We have three of us who are going to talk about what we're doing in science fiction here. I'm Jay Telotte, professor in LMC, and to my right is Professor Lisa Yaszek, the undergraduate director in LMC, and to my left is professor of the profession. Is that right?
Practice.
Practice. Professor of the practice, Kathleen Goonan, one of our most noted science fiction authors, and someone who has lent her presence here and had it felt amongst our students in all sorts of interesting ways for the last 4 years now?
Since 2010.
Yeah. And so we'll each offer a little bit of insight into what we do, and then we'll also try to at least give you an insight to where we want to go with some of the implications of this interest, and that is some pedagogical concerns, programmatic concerns that we'd like to share with you. And we'll also allow time, I hope, for some comments and questions and et cetera. So who am I? What am I doing here? I've been at Georgia Tech for 30 plus years. I introduced film studies to the curriculum here. My focus has generally been on film genres, and especially genres of fantasy. My first book was really about horror and fantasy film. Second abortive book, never saw the light of day. I threw my hands up and threw it at the wall, was something on the musical. And then on science fiction. And in fact, since the early 1990s, much of my work has been on science fiction. And it's focused generally on the relationship between the human image and technology, or on the way in which science fiction is inflected by specific media. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that I do, I'll just hold up some books and throw images of books out there. You know, this is, I might not get them back.
Plus I get food all over that.
Yeah.
So.
This is something called Replications, with the clever subtitle, A Robotic History of the Science Fiction Film. And what I was trying to do was to take something sort of fundamental to film, and that is the movies essentially technologize the human image. And I thought this would be an interesting way of also thinking about science fiction and its intersections with movies, because science fiction is there from the very start of the movies. In the 1890s, we already have science fiction film. And so what I did was I used that as a trope for tracing out the whole history of both science fiction and film. Nice little book. This one is a distant technology. Came about 5 years after that one, and it's about science fiction as it becomes a measure of the difficulty modern culture had in becoming technologically modern, and that is, it's about the machine age, the period from about 1900 to 1940, and what I tried to do was to look at how different cultures met the challenges of technology and met them and narratized them in film. And so I looked at Russian, French, British, German, and American science fiction there. This one is simply called the science fiction film. And it's, how does science fiction film work? What are its narrative types? What kinds of stories do we tell? And I brought the Spanish translation because it's got a better cover than the American translation. It was published by Cambridge University Press, and Cambridge does really bland covers. But as soon as they turned it over to a Spanish publisher, they did a much nicer cover. And more recently, I'll have to hold this one this way, science fiction TV. What is science fiction like on television? And what's its history? I talk about history, I talk about its narrative models, both industrial models, and those things that were forced on it because of the very nature of television, and generic narratives, as different types of narratives that we'll find in other forms of science fiction. And I looked at cultural issues, I looked at the audience, and then speculated on where it's going. So what's going to happen with science fiction on television? So that's where I've been. Most recently, and I guess this is much more our concern here, is what are we doing now? What sort of stuff are we interested in right now? More recently, I've been working in areas that I guess I like to generally term, this is probably being too generous with my generality, I like to generously term media ecology, and that is various ways in which the film text, for example, simply ripples out and affects other things, and is in turn affected by the things that are around it. And so one simple example of that is something I finished a few months ago, a piece on global science fiction cinema. But the global science fiction cinema text as a multiple text. And as a case study, what I tried to look at were what are called MLVs, multiple language versions. As what happens when you make a text and then redo it and redo it and redo it for different cultures, and you use different languages. And we're not talking about simply putting a new soundtrack on. We're not talking about dubbing, which is pretty commonplace, but rather a practice that was popular from about 1929 to about 1935, where you actually reshot the entire film with new casts speaking in different languages, sometimes with a different director, but all using the same sets, using the same basic script, or at least the plot outline, and using some of the same footage, but not all the same footage. And unsurprisingly, the films, while they all tend to be grouped under one heading as this film, when you look at those inflections, they turn to be quite different. Another is considering how advertising affects our sense of the film text. And in my case study in this instance has been 1950s science fiction advertising, print advertising essentially, lobby cards, posters, newspaper and magazine advertisements, and focusing on the same kinds of films, films that wound up having, not surprisingly, very much the same kind of advertising, and yet the advertising almost never coincided with the films themselves. And so I'm looking at that sort of disjunction between the discourse that was put out about the film and the actual film as audiences saw it. And perhaps not surprisingly, at least 3 or 4 cases I found that reviewers of the period, they noticed that. They noticed that there was something different between what they were led to expect and what they actually got to see. And they told readers about that. And more recently, and I guess I'm a little embarrassed because it seems like I might be going back and just excavating some old material. But because I've been working in this notion with this notion of ecologies in the back of my mind, and what a notion that's often linked to media ecology is the cultural meme. And a cultural meme is an idea or concept that attaches to perhaps a popular text like a film, but it's something that's characterized, according to Richard Dawkins, who came up with the idea quite a while back. It's characterized by what he calls fidelity, and that is the same image or same kind of text or same plots or same characters will show up over and over and over. It's characterized by fecundity, and that is its ability to inspire other texts and to grow and create viable variations, and then longevity, or what I like to think of as persistence, as certain things just persist. And so what I've gotten interested in is the persistence of certain kinds of robots in science fiction, in media science fiction. And I'm focusing in on 3 different persistent figures and how they work across media, and how they've inflected our whole experience of science fiction. I guess the other thing we're supposed to talk about in some way is what's that, and this is Carol's phrase, what's at stake here? And I'm not sure exactly what's at stake. I know why I'm doing these things, and that is, one, it's almost like we have no choice if you're interested in science fiction. We inhabit a pointedly science fictional world these days. We are surrounded by, in fact, science fiction texts, and we need to make sense of them for both our individual and our cultural health. And 2, because science fiction is one of those genres of choice today. Everyone's doing science fiction. And I can talk about more details of that later. It's also become one of the key forms for addressing our most pressing issues, which all tend to be technologically connected, it seems. And we need to understand how it formulates, or in some cases reformulates, those issues. And just as a very brief note, consider the various reality TV shows that have adopted the language, the images, and the basic concerns of science fiction. Shows like Ancient Aliens, or UFO Chasers, or The Unexplained Files, or Morgan Freeman's Through the Wormhole, or Dark Matters, etc. Science fiction is no longer just that paradox of fictional science. It is science and reality, and science fictional reality. And they're just, we've got to look at how we've blurred those borders, and why. So addressing these concerns is really what's at stake in my ongoing work with science fiction, and it just strikes me as one of the very fundamental purposes of Georgia Tech, is addressing those issues. So that's my spiel, and Lisa, you're going to go next, right?
All right. So again, I'm Lisa Yaszek from Literature, Media, and Communication. I'm a professor and director of undergraduate studies in LMC. I'm also past president of the Science Fiction Research Association, which is the oldest it's the oldest organization, professional organization dedicated to the serious study of science fiction across media. I have another title I've made up for myself. I like to call myself the director of sci-fi at Tech, which is the sort of umbrella term that I've been using to talk about the different kinds of science fiction-oriented initiatives that we've been doing at Tech since long before I got here, but certainly that we've continued to do since I've gotten here. And that includes, as many of you know, annual symposia, author and artist visits, the sci-fi research and radio labs, and right now the Rite of Passage film, which is a film that faculty and students from Georgia Tech are working on in conjunction with a group of science fiction authors and filmmakers from the greater Atlanta community. So my own research is bound together by an interest in science fiction as the premier story form of modernity. It's in essence a global language that allows people to talk about the experience of science and technology across centuries, continents, and cultures. So for instance, in my own work, I brought books as well for show and tell. We thought this might be more exciting than a PowerPoint, because everyone falls asleep during a PowerPoint. I know what happens, and I don't know that we're any different than our students that way. So my first book, The Self-Wired, which has a very plain and simple cover, but that's okay, is about how mainstream authors and filmmakers use science fiction tropes to make sense of the self and society in an increasingly techno-scientific world. So in this book, I look at everything from very canonical authors like Ralph Ellison and Thomas Pynchon to science fiction authors like William Gibson, and then to filmmakers like Steven Spielberg. This book actually originally came out in 2003, and it's now part of Routledge's new print-on-demand series. So this is something that you can now get for a very affordable price once again from Routledge. This is actually the print-on-demand version, which sadly is prettier than the original version. Another book that I wanted to talk about a little bit is Galactic Suburbia. This one's got a great cover. I don't know if you can see it here. This is Jerry Cobb. She was one of the original 12 women astronauts who was trained for outer space. It was a 2-year program, semi-funded by NASA. It never got off the ground. But a number of women were involved. And in fact, as some of you might know, Edwin Teller, the father of the H-bomb, he actually had testified to Congress that women should go into space before men because they weigh less and have more common sense. So. And these are the kind of stories I'm talking about in Galactic Suburbia. What I'm looking at here is how women have used science fiction to participate in debates over their work in very traditionally feminine roles, as homemakers, as wives and mothers, but also in other roles as activists, scientists, and artists. So in this book, like I said, so that's what I'm looking at. This is primarily, I'm looking at science fiction after World War II here. So prior to the advent of feminist science fiction. But I'm also looking at how this kind of work very much anticipated the concerns that are still with us today. Another thing that I've done work on that I think is interesting is I don't look just at how people inside and closely related to the science fiction community have used science fiction. So I'm not looking just at artists. I also like to look at, for instance, how scientists do or don't use science fiction. So a few years ago, as Richard Bark knows, because he was the PI for this, we did an NSF nanoscale exploratory research grant mapping how representations of small-scale engineering circulate through popular scientific and public policy realms. And that was really an interesting and enlightening experience. So I was on board, 2 people from public policy, and then a nanoscientist from GTRI. And it was an interesting experience because we all had to learn each other's disciplines and really work through some of the details of the different ways we approached ideas, texts, science, everything from the ground up. And we started with the assumption that these ideas start in science and they move to public policy and then out into popular culture. And of course, much to my delight, by the time we were done with this, we realized it was completely backwards, and that authors had been talking about this for about 200 or 400 years, and that key figures actually in the history of nanoscience and technology were actively drawing on science fictional representations of small-scale engineering as they thought through the formations of this discipline. I see a number of you nodding here. So obviously we have the converted in the room, and I don't have to say any more about that particular subject. All right, my current research is both enabled by and actually about the transformation of science fiction studies in a digital age. And I don't have as many props for this, unfortunately. So one of the main areas I'm working in right now is Afrofuturism, which is black speculative fiction across media. My work began by looking primarily at African American and Afro-diasporic science fiction, but right now I'm working mostly on actually African science fiction. It's a pretty recent phenomenon. Africa has one of the shortest histories of science fiction around many other countries. You know, China's science fiction tradition goes back to the 1860s. Brazil's goes back to the 1830s. I think Portugal's goes back to the 1820s. African science fiction is about 30 years old, maybe at the most, but it has exploded. It's very much a pan-African endeavor. There are very few countries, even South Africa, which has a science fiction fan society. Most countries can't support an independent, a dedicated science fiction publishing house. So you see a lot of collaboration, which authors and editors talk about as being a really kind of mind-blowing experience because Africa itself is so diverse that it's very interesting to try to negotiate this. But what's really cool is everyone asks, how do you find this? How do you do this? What languages do you know? The beauty of it is you don't have to know very much at all, it turns out. You can speak English and use the internet. You can find out all about African science fiction on your own. It's very much a digital phenomenon. And English is still very much the lingua franca of science and technology and of science fiction. So much of this is published in English, and when it's not, it's usually published in French. So it's very easy to find. And authors and texts, they're easily available online. You can go Facebook famous people on, and make friends with them. There's a lot of action that takes place in venues like the online social network, the Black Science Fiction Society, which is Facebook for people who like Black speculative fiction, and of course in Second Life. And in fact, they've done a 5 continents reading, and the 5 continents readings are usually led by a young man from Ghana. He's still an undergraduate, but he's really quickly becoming one of the spokespeople for African science fiction. So that's pretty cool stuff you can find too. The other thing I'm working on right now, so that's looking at the present and maybe even the future. The other thing I'm doing is using digital tools and technologies to look backwards into the science fiction archive, and specifically at the ecology of the science fiction magazine. So as Jay was saying, and I think this is a movement right now in science fiction, to look at how science fiction is produced not just by a few key authors in a few key books, but as a more interactive and dynamic form that happens across media and across writing disciplines. So in this book, for instance, I had started it because once I put out, when I did Galactic Suburbia, a number of editors said, you should really do a critical anthology of these stories because they're not accessible anywhere. And I said, yeah, totally, that's what I'm going to do next. But when I went into the archives and started looking at this, what I realized is the stories were only a fraction of the story, so to speak. That women are working not just in the production of fiction, but since the beginning of the science fiction community, they've been working as editors, as poets. In fact, women invented science fiction poetry. If you're not familiar with it, maybe not one of our finest moments in history, I'd say, but that's okay. And what else do women do? Science fiction illustration, and even science journalism. Some of the earliest science journalism in America was actually done by women in science fiction magazines. And an interesting point there, that one of the key women working in that was L. Taylor Hanson, who also invented the genre of ancient alien writing. So all of those channels you find on your on-demand networks, yeah, that's because of her. So women did a lot of really exciting things. That's been great stories, and if you want to hear more, I can tell you awesome stories. Women, there's one of the women I'm looking at, she's the only person in the world, she has an FBI file based on seditious science fiction poetry. Yeah, see, good stuff happening there. So this has been a lot of fun to work on. But both my work on African science fiction and my work on women's science fiction at the beginning of the 20th century, I really couldn't do this kind of work. Even, it's different now than it was when I started both these projects 3 years ago, and it could not have been done 5, maybe 10 years ago. Really, you need to have the digital tools. It's the first time the magazines have been digitized. It's easier to get to them, and even when you do travel to archives now, you don't have to use a pencil and paper. You can just take photos of everything. It makes a massive difference in the amount of data you can look at and think about. And it's interesting, I know that there's a movement now called modern periodical studies where we're really looking, I see some of you nodding, at the way our ideas about text and authority are being transformed by this kind of new access to old materials, and it's something we're seeing very much in science fiction as well. And so this is something I've started to think about and theorize at a more meta level as well. I have a piece called Narrative Archive and Database, which looks at how digital tools are transforming science fiction research and how it demands that we reconsider what counts as knowledge, research, and authority. And I can tell you on the women's work in early science fiction book, we don't even know at this point how to parse out authority, because we don't know if we wrote this. I have a co-author. If our research assistants who were texting us from archives at all kinds of strange hours, and I don't know how they were in archives at strange hours, but the text came through at strange hours. It has been such a collaborative effort. The librarians at Georgia Tech, the information specialists, they've been amazing. They get really excited, and they're like, wow, did you know about this website and this website? So it's been an amazing and truly collaborative experience, like I said. So I've been thinking about that and writing about it, and the piece I wrote on, this is my last show and tell, this is the blank from the award I just won for my work on science fiction and the digital humanities. I don't have the real award, I left it at home, sorry. Plus it's really Okay, so again, why these kinds of explorations at Georgia Tech? And I want to talk more, maybe, I think Jay's done a good job of covering why do it at all, because this is the soup we swim in, and you can't get away from science fiction. It's both the blessing and curse of being a science fiction studies scholar. Everyone you talk to has an opinion about science fiction, and they do go on and on. And often with great insights and wonderful stories. It's a great way to tell stories. I think at Georgia Tech, though, there are very specific reasons that we would want to continue to pursue science fiction studies. We have a historical commitment to it, first and foremost. The first science fiction class was taught here by my predecessor, Bud Foote, in 1971, and in fact, that was one of the first accredited college classes in the world on science fiction. So we already have a reputation for doing this, doing it well, and having done it for a long time. As many of you know, Bud was instrumental in bringing a number of major authors to Georgia Tech, Fred Pohl, Ursula K. Le Guin, Kim Stanley Robinson. And when he retired in 1998, he donated about 8,000 books to the Georgia Tech Library, and that's the core of the science fiction collection at Tech today. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Sherry can tell you more, I'm sure. But the science fiction collection has, I don't even know how many items at this point, 11 to 14,000, depending on sort of our mood and where we are, what I hear is going on with the cataloging. But we are considered one of the major, we're certainly the largest research collection of our kind in the Southeast. We're one of the largest collections of kind in the United States. And we've been named by Science Fiction Studies as one of the top 20 collections in the world. So this is important. We have a major, exciting resource here, and people who come to use it from as far away as Portugal, in fact. So people have, on the international scene, have a recognition of us and our existence. I think Science Fiction Studies is also a natural fit with the Georgia Tech strategic plan. In the plan, we say that we want to establish ourselves as leaders at the intersection of science, technology, and the art, and to produce global citizens. This is something that, if you do science fiction studies, you're automatically contributing to both of these things. As we've been talking about, science fiction is a global language, and I think that there really is a value added to our students' degrees if they can go out into the world and be able to have conversations with people in other cultures, in part on their reading of science and technology across culture, or as a common language. But also, it's a great way to think through what is a culture's attitude to science and technology. You can learn a lot about what you can and can't build, for instance, by looking at the history of how building is represented in science fiction traditions. Obviously, it's also important in terms of us being leaders in the intersection of science, technology, and the arts. Science fiction is an art that's about science and technology. That's its whole point. And so again, it seems this is just a natural thing that we can and should be doing here. As you know, we already have faculty and students who are working on and with science fiction in a variety of ways. Many of you are here with us today. The next step then, I think, is to identify the range of people who are engaged in this kind of work and to explore how our energy might be channeled into new programs. And that's something we want to talk with you about a little bit later today in this lunch. And that's what I've got for you. Thank you.
And Kathy?
Yes, I'm Kathleen Goonan, and as Jay mentioned, I've been here since the fall of 2010, first as a visiting professor and now as a professor of the practice. And my practice is the writing of science fiction, both in a fictional sense and in a critical sense, because I have been writing science fiction criticism pretty much since I started writing science fiction. My first professional work was published in 1990, and since then I brought, just as an example of about as much as I could carry or grab from my office. My first science fiction novel was Queen City Jazz, and it was one of the very first novels that looked at nanotechnology. And it's a Drexlerian nanotech, if any of you are familiar with Eric Drexler's kind of visionary and imaginative take on nanotechnology versus what became the U.S. government's version of what nanotechnology is and what it could do, much more practical. It was a New York Times notable book, and I went on to write. I got a lot of questions from interviewers about, is this really going to happen? I said, no, I sure hope not. We're not all going to turn into, well, there are giant bees in here, and there are all the American arts that are accessed through metapheromonal receptors in people's hands for various reasons, but no, let's hope not. Which brings up the point, does science fiction predict the future? Sometimes it's intimately related to the future. Sometimes not, but and often it is, but in a sideways sort of way. This is the first novel in my nanotech quartet, and I have a couple of more of them here. Well, I don't have Crescent City Rhapsody. I don't have Mississippi Blues. I have the final one, which was light music. Two of these were Nebula Award finalists. This was a British Science Fiction Society Award finalist when it came out in England. And In War Times was my sixth novel. It won the John W. Campbell Memorial Award. And it's based on my father's World War II memoirs. He was in ordnance during World War II and he did not help develop it, but he worked on the then top secret project of radar, shortwave radar, which a lot of people claim won the war. And he was also in Germany before the surrender as part of the outpost of people who were getting ready for the invasion of Germany. So it did win the John W. Campbell Award, and then This Shared Dream is the follow-up to that, which is my latest novel. It was published in 2010. Angels and You Dogs is a short story collection, which was published in 2011. And just to remind myself, this is Partner for Lieben. I have a story published in this German anthology. And so my stories and novels have been published they've been translated into British English, most of them. They've been published in France, in Germany, in Russia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Japan, Russia, did I say Russia? And probably in a lot of places that I really don't know about. I've published about 45 short stories in professional magazines such as Asimov's. And one of my latest stories is in the Hieroglyph Anthology, which just came out, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It's called Stories and Visions for a Better Future, and it kind of builds on and reflects what Jay and Lisa were talking about in respect to the importance of science fiction at Georgia Tech. I have a lot of essays, reviews, and short stories online as well. And in 2002, I was featured in Scientific America as one of the shamans of the small because of my science fiction work in nanotechnology. Last summer, I was in Popular Science as one of the 10 something minds, 10 best minds or whatever, working in science fiction today. In my latest academic work is in Intelligence Unbound, the future of uploaded and machine minds. It's supposed to have been published by Wiley Blackwell, but it's not. It will be soon. And my essay is The Future of Identity, Implications, Challenges, and Complications of Human-Machine Consciousness. And due to strenuous negotiation on the part of the editors, I get a free copy of this $300 book. Yay, so at some point I'll actually be able to hold it in my hand. It should be pretty interesting because it has a lot of the luminaries of the transhuman and post-human movement in the United States and internationally, which is weird and fascinating. And my latest short story, actually, one of my latest short stories I published for this year, it's called A Short History of the 20th Century, or When You Wish Upon a Star, and it's at Tor.com, and you can read it for free. And I was asked to write it because of it's Tor.com's birthday in July, and it had to have rockets in it. And at first I thought, I'll have to do calculations. I'll have to be engineer-like. And then I thought, no, I know a lot about rockets. I know a lot about the history of rocketry. And so I read it from that point of view. And it's tagged as being fiction with science in it, but not science fictional, because there the lines kind of blur, and people argue about what is science fiction all the time. It's about a girl whose father was a rocket scientist in the 50s, and she wants to be one too when she grows up, but she runs into all the barriers that young women have run into for centuries in terms of education, but even in the 50s, being taken seriously, attending MIT and having to stick it out, It also actually, I use Jay's Science Fiction TV as one of my references because it has a lot of Disney in it in his Man in Space series. So, so that's a lot of my research is for these stories and novels because they're heavily researched. Okay, what I'm doing at Tech is I teach classes about science fiction literature, which blend into science fiction film and the history of science and technology, as well as the science fiction community itself, which is an interesting and varied bunch of people, going back, as Jay said, hundreds of years, and including women as well as men, before women began publishing a little bit more science fiction in the early days of American science fiction, and then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there's a big wave, especially in the 70s, of more women publishing science fiction. So, and I'm also teaching creative writing, and one of my students, there's a Dell undergraduate Excellence in Writing Science Fiction Award. First prize is a free trip to Orlando to the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts, where they give first prize. This is over spring break, and the first prize is $500. One of my students, Alyssa Hartenbaum, was an honorable mention. I encourage all my students to send out their work and become involved in the real world of publishing, because you don't have to wait until you have a lot of degrees and everything to if you are interested at all in writing, the time to start sending things out is now, and see what happens. Jonathan Lethem, who has written science fiction and who won a MacArthur grant, Genius Grant, about 10 years ago, didn't finish college. He just went to Middlebury 1 year and dropped out. So, not to say that everyone should drop out, but that the time to start sending your work out is now. And then another student from my science fiction class, whom I gave the option of writing a science fiction story instead of writing a final story, also entered that contest. Did not win, but I continue to send out contest announcements to my students. He entered another contest, The Future Powered by Fiction, and he was one of 10 winners, and he won $1,000. So, out of the relatively few number of students I've taught, and that is much more finely focused on how science fiction can actually influence the world around us. So, but in my creative writing class, we don't necessarily just write science fiction. I welcome all kinds of fiction in my creative writing class, and the students learn how to critique fiction, and that teaches them how to write. Oddly enough, when they're critiquing stories that they have all read, and they see what other people think about them, then it's part of the process of learning to think in a fictional way, and to think effectively as a fiction writer. The wider picture of science fiction at Georgia Tech is that as a technical and engineering university, science fiction is a natural link between the two cultures of literature and technology and science. I mean, it is the link between the two cultures. Science fiction is a broad spectrum of literature, just science fiction literature. There is a lot of fiction that can be argued is science fiction, but you'd have to look really hard to see the traditional tropes that one thinks of when you think of science fiction, aliens, space travel, or all of these kinds of things might not be there, because there are so many kinds of science fiction that they can be mysteries, they can be adventure stories, they can be just about anything you can think of as being a genre of literature, including just personal, the personal kinds of explorations of emotions that one thinks of as being non-science fictional are often also science fictional. So and the reason is because I think it's becoming more and more difficult to write fiction that does not take into account the technological world in which we live. I think Anne Pratchett was complaining on the NewsHour one night that in her latest novel she had to figure out how her characters would not have a cell phone. I mean, she had to think about it a lot because obviously if people have cell phones, the plots of a lot of stories change. So you have to, it has to fall into the boiling river or something. Science fiction, I think, explores the ethical issues. It's ethical issues of how we relate to technology, how it affects us, how it may affect us in the future. A lot of these things are ethical issues that are foregrounded in so much of science fiction that it is a way for students at a technical university to think about how technology and science is going to change us, how it may change us, how it has changed us, how we do things, even though we're still the same humans that we were thousands of years ago. That's rapidly changing. I have a couple of eye and hip implants myself, and as the opportunities arise, we adapt into and use technology eagerly, and that's what's going to happen. And that's what happened in the debate about the positioning of nanotechnology in research and in the public eye. And I think that that's what's going to happen with a lot of other technologies as well. Genetic engineering and genetically modified food, for one thing, just things like that. A lot of the things that I do as a science fiction writer, I also interface with government and business and a lot of different worlds in my role as a science fiction writer. Once I published my nanotech quartet, I was invited to a lot of universities to speak, including Georgia Tech back in the early 2000s, about how nanotechnology might affect us. And then I became a member of Sigma. Sigma is a group that consults with the government, or will consult with anyone who will pay us, but it's a fairly large organization. It's weighted heavily towards people with PhDs in science or technology. As an English person, I have contributed quite a lot. My first Sigma event was the Joint Services Small Arms Project, which has been a Pentagon committee since the 1940s. And the meeting was about how we can create futuristic weapons to fight terrorists. It was a small meeting. I'd say it was smaller than this, maybe about the same size. And as I started to think about it, I thought, well, all these science fiction writers, there are about 8 of us there, they're probably going to say, well, invisibility, cloaking, genetic engineering, fighting people by making very loud noises, and things like this. And I thought, well, in my mind, our greatest weapon against terrorism is universal literacy. And that was my talk. And they were all rather surprised, but that's pretty much what I've done for Sigma. I went to Riyadh to the Global Competitiveness Forum in January of 2012, and the Global Competitiveness Forum is a huge international forum that Bill Gates was a keynote speaker at one year, and Bill Clinton was a keynote speaker at another year. And once again, the Sigma group gave their take on a whole bunch of different things. And again, I gave my talk about universal literacy and how important it is, and wondered how we are going to do that. I just, throw that out. And next week, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., or the following week for the book launch of Hieroglyph, which was featured in the New York Times the day before yesterday. Science fiction writers take a rosier view. And I believe everybody who's involved in science fiction can do these things, because it's a way of thinking about the world. And in our science fiction classes, students learn to think about the world in a science fictional way, which is becoming the way that most people do think about the world in the future. This was begun as a collaboration between the Arizona State University and science fiction writers, and Slate Magazine is going to be at the book launch. The government is involved in terms of funding. The White House staff of technology and science is going to be at the book launch, and the panels we're going to do. And this book is about practical ways in which science fiction depictions of how we can make a better world. So, and that was, everybody in the book had their own take on it. Neil Stevenson was pretty much the science fiction writer who got everybody interested and revved up about it. And so we have science fiction writers like Bruce Sterling, who's a well-known futurist, Elizabeth Bear, Cory Doctorow, who's another well-known futurist and journalist. And so we're all going to talk about how science fiction can directly envision the ways in which science fiction can make differences in the world in which we live and the world in which we will live. And again, this is part of the bigger picture of science fiction at Georgia Tech, because the engineers, the students in LMC, the students in Ivan Allen College are all going to be going out into a science fictional world. And the tools that they learn to use in thinking about science fiction are creative tools. And they learn to think imaginatively about the world. And I think that this thinking tool is very important. They become part of a wider conversation, because science fiction is a conversation. The people in science fiction are gregarious. The academics and writers interface with one another frequently, and writers interface with government and business, as I've already mentioned. So I think that science fiction at Tech is very relevant to the wider world, and I do believe that it will help students who graduate play a wider and more savvy leadership role. So that's about all that I'm doing and what I'm thinking about the importance of science fiction today.
We're not. Do you want us to talk about programmatic issues or not? Yeah, I think the natural segue for Kathy's comments have to do with our issues, our concerns with perhaps programs in science fiction at Georgia Tech. And what Lisa's passing out to you right now is a proposal for a master's degree, as well as for...
The minor's on top.
And I was going to get to that, and a minor that will be is already in place, right?
We're doing that. We're coming through this, yes.
And so we want to share with you and invite you to share your ideas with us regarding possible participation in our science fiction programs, real and or hypothetical programs.
Right. So if I can just take a moment to give you an overview of why you're starting to look at this. The front of the science fiction minor is boring. The interesting stuff starts on page 2. That's just the narrative we have to approve it. But what I wanted to note is that science fiction studies, many universities all over the world have faculty like us doing clusters of science fiction work. And increasingly those universities are thinking about how to leverage this into program building. At any given point in time, there's about maybe 10 or 12 science fiction programs. They primarily happen at the graduate level, but there are a few undergraduate programs and minors as well. So the furthest away, and maybe the most exciting, is Beijing Normal University has a master's degree in science fiction studies. It's actually housed in their curriculum and instruction department and headed up by, forgetting his name right now, I want to say maybe Yan, who's a very famous science fiction author. There's 2 programs of note in the UK. The University of Glamorgan, I think I'm pronouncing that right, I have no idea, it's in Wales, has a bachelor's degree actually in science and science fiction, and that's hosted by their Center for Astronomy. The other major program is the University of Liverpool, which has a well-known master's degree in science fiction studies. We actually have sent graduates from LMC into that program, and they now have real tenure-track jobs as professors themselves, so it was successful. Unfortunately, both of the UK programs are currently closed due to austerity measures. So what we know that means is that there are populations of students who are looking to go elsewhere to do this kind of work. And in fact, that need is being met in the United States. There are a number of new programs that have opened in the last few years. So for instance, the University of Kansas has a Center for Science Fiction Studies. They've always had that. You can specialize in science fiction at any degree level that you want, and you'd be working with James Gunn, who's a famous science fiction author who wrote many of the original Star Trek scripts, if that sort of gives you a place to hang on to. Florida Atlantic University is our nearest neighbor doing science fiction. They have a master's degree in literature and theory with a concentration in science fiction studies. And then the University of California, Riverside has a PhD with a designated emphasis in science fiction and technoculture studies. And they're currently building a minor in that. That would be the program that I think would be maybe the closest to what we're thinking about, since they're doing both a minor and a graduate program. But we can do it differently, and honestly, I think we can do it better. With the exception of the Welsh program, every one of these programs is housed in an extremely traditional humanities department and has a fairly conventional humanities-based agenda. Students tend to learn about science fiction through 1, maybe 2 critical lenses at the most. They might go and take some classes on the history of medicine or the history of science and technology, but again, it's housed almost exclusively within the humanities with a sort of quick nod to the social sciences. If you look around the room here, we have a different situation at Georgia Tech. We have the situation of being at a technological institute, where students and faculty can talk with scientists as well as authors and scholars. So we can give them a really dynamic kind of environment. The other thing we could do is I think we could build something really, truly interdisciplinary. I'm looking out at people here. We have people from the library, we have people from INTA, from public policy, from math. I don't know what else I'm forgetting, HTS, who else have I forgotten? I don't know, I'm sorry for who else. I know there were people from computer science who were planning to be here as well, and I'd love to see the architects get on board. So I think we can do something exciting and new, and that's what it means to us. This is a good time to get into the game. There are students who want this. There are programs growing in the United States, and we can do it. Like I said, we have all the same resources as the other programs, and we have more. So did you want to talk about the master's degree?
Well, no, you've said almost everything I was going to say. So, except for the fact that when you said interdisciplinary, I think you left out something that close to my heart, and that is we're talking not just about literature. You look at something like the Kansas program. The Kansas program it's all about literature, and that's it. We do film, we do television, we do digital media, we do science fiction gaming, for example. We have that ability to go places where no program has gone before. So, and that's what we hope to invite people to share with us your interests that might help to build the program. We talked about this a couple of years ago, and I did collect a few sample syllabi. I still have Peter's. You don't even remember you sent one to me, do you? No. All right. I still have one from Peter. So we are very much interested in hearing your thoughts, and that's why we pass out the master's outline as it was originally conceived, and it is not frozen or written in stone. So we're looking for thoughts on that. Kathy, did you want to add anything?
Well, only that I think that with the resources in LMC, in Ivan Allen College, science fiction, gender studies is central to one powerful branch of science fiction, and vice versa. The social sciences, just about, and of course political science, just about everything that we study at Ivan Allen College. You'll find relevant science fiction texts, and in history as well. I use Ray Bradbury's "There Will Come Soft Rains" to show my students in my From the Earth to the Moon, the 60s class, about how pervasive the fear of nuclear fallout was in a possible nuclear war. And that illustrated that better than people saying, oh yes, well, we built a fallout shelter in our backyard and things like that. Because it's a masterful story. And because we are creatures that create stories, we talk in stories, in arguments, and science fiction is just a very natural connection and confluence of all these areas of research that we do here, which I think a master's would expand on all of those and relate to all of those.
Well, I guess that's it for our presentation. We just want to open up then to comments, questions, thoughts on either doing sci-fi at Georgia Tech or perhaps programmatic issues. Yeah.
Well, they're there, and so far, what I've found in my work is that, while Kathy is right, and I think what you're getting at is that the visibility of women in science fiction comes and goes in ways. The numbers are steady from the go. It's always been about the same. And then that alone is an interesting insight, I think. The visibility comes and goes, and part of it has to do with, a lot of the women involved in the early science fiction community got erased by the second generation of editors who came into science fiction in the late 30s and early 40s. And many of them were part of the feminist backlash and the backlash against the suffrage movement, and came in with very firm convictions that women couldn't write science fiction, even though about 20 or 30% of the original science fiction crew were women. And they would tell women who'd already won like awards and things that, oh, you can't write, which makes no sense. But at that point, the women decided to go elsewhere, and then you wait for the next generation to come and beat the walls down again. But they're there, and so what happened was when that first anti-feminist generation showed up, they also created the first sets of anthologies, and they took women out of the anthologies. In fact, Leslie Stone has a story about there was a soft launch for one of the first anthologies, and her husband had gone to it. She was doing something else, and they said, well, it's great to meet you, Mr. Stone. And he said, oh, I'm not Leslie Stone, that's my wife. And they pulled her story. So, it's been, I think, a battle, and I think the nice thing with the digital technologies is it allows us to unearth both the activities that women were doing and these stories that they have about why it seems like women go in and out of fashion in science fiction. And you can do this with race, with anything, really.
Some of the disciplines suited more.
Well, that's actually not as true as it seems. What happened was, yes, a number of people used their initials. That was true of both men and women. But almost every woman allowed pictures of herself to be printed with her stories.
Okay.
So that's a story that's come about. There was one woman who purposely disguised herself as a man for a very long time. And that one woman, that story has sort of eaten up all the other stories. This is the same one who invented the ancient aliens genre, by the way. She's responsible for a lot of madness. C.L. Moore, she went by her initials for a much more practical reason. This was the Great Depression. She had a job at a bank, and she knew she would lose her job if they found out she had another stream of income. Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of times, it was either because it was the fashion, a lot of men used their initials as well. It was sort of the thing at the time. Or like I said, there were really practical reasons that didn't always have to do with sex and gender.
Peter, you had a comment?
When I haven't scrutinized the document training master's program, but as I've looked through it, it still feels very heavily literature oriented. And you're talking about bridging across to other schools, and I'm curious as to what you think that might look like. Like, what I think of, and I could be totally wrong, is that you would have individuals in the master's program, in a sense, identifying some technology from some set of science fiction works. And then that person saying, now what would be involved in actually making this happen? And so I'll use the example, maybe not a good one, of the space elevator. And say, okay, what do you need to do to make a space elevator work? Well, you need material science to figure out how to do that long cable. You need to have robotics, mechanical engineering, to have things that fall up and down, all this kind of stuff. Is that what you have in mind? Is that you'll have people that will, in a sense, try to go into there and say, look, I think I can help you think about how to build that space elevator.
I'm not so sure about the nuts and bolts of building. Old nuts and bolts are a pretty old metaphor, right? But I am thinking about something like, how do you design a better world? How do you design a better city? How do you design, we think in terms of utopia, and it's usually the discussion of the politics of the utopia. But we have a school, we have a college of architecture, and we have designers over there who are best placed to help us think about what a city should look like. That's one of the things that immediately jumps out at me.
I think that list that is from a few years ago.
Yeah.
Now, as you'll notice, it still says LCC, in fact, on that white paper. But I went through for the minor and I started to update and pull. And there's, as you'll see here, actually my list of non-LMC courses became much larger than my list of even now and college courses. So I think there is room to do more interactive work and that's part of the reason we wanted to have you here today. What classes do you guys know about, or what labs are there? What kinds of things could we add into this? This is a very preliminary draft of this degree.
And let me just add, it was done at a time when we were under far more constraints resource-wise. The ultimate problem at Georgia Tech is if you want to do something new, you have to be able to create the fiction that you can do without any new resources. And so you look at you've been around long enough, you know that. And so you look around at what you have in your neighborhood that you can mobilize very quickly. And that's why, again, we bring this to a group so we can get better at creating a document like that. Yeah, Ann?
And then the person in front of him.
I don't know that this is practical in this particular case, but I wonder if you thought about a more open sense of how students can do their own. So I know from my own graduate education in history, anthropology, science, and technology, I found it really interesting to take courses at Harvard Medical School that were on cardiovascular pathophysiology, and I was interested in smoking. And then, but that's individually driven. Obviously, you can't get cardiovascular pathophysiology a requirement or even an elective for science and health science. But if students can choose whatever it is that they're interested in, right? And I can imagine that, I don't know if you all know, in the food, that those mechanics that are inspired by animals, like how you do mechanical engineering, and everything inspired by animals. You can imagine someone doing some science fiction saying, oh, okay, I want to see it kill that new object.
Yeah.
Yes.
Class, you know what I mean?
Yes.
But it's not about collecting a list of classes,
Mhm.
but about saying, choose a couple of classes
Right.
in science or engineering with a professor's permission to allow you to audit or take part in it.
Well, that's one of the richnesses of Georgia Tech. And we have so many of those things going on, many of which we don't know about. What we have to do is to find ways of making that richness available while staying within the sort of degree constraints that Georgia Tech imposes. And that is, how much can you audit that actually counts towards a degree? How long should a degree be? Richard Sharon, LMC, he's suggested that it might be most feasible to think in terms of something that people could do within a year. That is the most marketable kind of master's right now, and he knows that better than I think any of us do. And so you start thinking about ways that make something more feasible, but that also don't fully use that richness that we have available to us.
Having said that, I was going to say, I think it's a great idea to build something like that in. I have this fantasy that a lot of master's degrees have a language requirement that we could say you could either do a language or you could do a lab. You could go get a scientist here to agree to let you be in their lab for a semester or two, and you would pick up the language of science and technology that way and perhaps lend something of your own critical and writing expertise to that lab.
And it is something that is not practical to actually take for a grade, which probably learning only when it comes here and developing it. But one other model that I've heard about is where, so at humanities or social science faculty would oversee the study. So the student audits the course, but then you work with the humanities or the professor, and that's what you get the credit for.
That's a good idea.
That's a great idea.
In that way, even as you are getting this exposure that obviously each faculty member can't realistically go to each lab, but can start to, and students can learn about themselves.
You have a thesis requirement, it looks like right now?
Well, it's bracketed, and notice that that's something we need to talk about.
Yeah, it might be, like, that might be something tied to the thesis thing, as
Yeah.
part of the, like, independent study or something that's kind of that thing.
Mhm.
And you had something, yes.
Yeah, just to go on with mentioning other disciplines beyond literature. Film, there's the domain of design fiction, or speculative design, creating physical objects to drive the conversation
Yeah.
forward. Actually, there's a class that not going to get digital media, Professor Carl Salvo,
Yeah.
speculative civics.
Yeah.
So looking at civics and creating these design objects for the conversation. I think Bruce Sterling, the science fiction
Yes,
writer,
does the design fiction stuff, right, yeah. Yeah, I've partnered with Carl and sort of co-taught, cross-taught his design class in my science fiction class before, so there's lots of, I think, possibilities with him. I would love to see the design stuff on board. I know Kathy, didn't we call this Designing the Future? We did this on purpose, because that language is
Yeah.
so rich around tech right now, and we'd love to draw in the industrial design people and the people in architecture as well. So if you have friends there, tell them, we're looking for a date.
The question that Jay brought up earlier, just absolutely fascinating, is the architectural spaces, say films and television, were at one point driven by what you could build and what you could paint on matte paint, and there were obvious restrictions and
$25 a week budget for sets for Captain Video.
yeah, but there are obvious, there are maybe some not so obvious restrictions on what we feel digital.
Yeah, yeah.
And how does that affect what we see?
Well, that has changed it radically, and you know, I did a collection a couple of years ago called Across the Screens. What happens when you try to translate science fiction from one medium to another medium? Particularly, we were interested in what happens when you go from television to film or from film to television. And certainly, one of the things that happened to a great extent in the 1950s, 60s, 70s is that you found that even though they were both screen media, you found that the screen actually sort of screened things off. It filtered off the best part of a film when you tried to bring it to television. And that's decreasingly the case today. I think we're, in fact, I was just talking to students earlier today about why it is we've gone to so much 3D film experience. And it's because the television experience has become so attractive in itself. You've got to find some way of keeping the audience from all jumping ship and only consuming through the various screens that they carry around with them or have in their living rooms.
One thinks that digital creation is completely open, but it's not in some ways. There's still constraints that from how we construct digitally spaces that must show up in films and television.
Give me an example.
I have no idea. Because I don't sit down and do it for a living.
Mhm.
But talk to the people that sit down and do it for a living.
Mhm.
I think the enablements, though, are really interesting. And one thing I've seen in my work on African science fiction is just massive amounts of independent filmmaking all over the place, because all you need is a phone, a smartphone, and Africans generally have great smartphones, better than ours, plainly. And you're seeing this real explosion of independent filmmaking. And this is something, in fact, that, I'm losing his name right now, but the young man who's the science fiction spokesperson for Pan-African science fiction, he talks about the fact that, by 2030, 2/3 of the world will be living in what we now call third world or developing nations, under the age of 30, and will have widespread access to digital technologies. And if you don't think that's a game changer, so just wait. He expects to see a massive shift in how we think about the world, the real and the unreal.
And maybe this speaks to your question more directly. And as I was looking at what's happening, what is the future of television, and certainly one is screens, and that is the screens that sort of draw us in because they're such high quality and the image is such high quality, and the other is interactivity, I sort of lost interest in it now, but initially I was very taken by this series Defiance. And what Defiance promised is that it would give you true interactivity because of that new digital regime. And so they were doing things online where you could sort of participate in the narrative. Could you come up with a way of stopping this, suggest ways of stopping this particular plague, for example? And if you did, or if you won this particular game online, you could actually appear in the series. They wouldn't fly to LA to do it. Rather, they actually put people in digitally. Put a face in there. Here's a wanted poster with this person's face. This is a person who was won an online game. So there are all sorts of imaginative ways that that digital regime is simply opening up and rendering our whole experience of science fiction science-fictional.
Dina?
It's a very flat, and non-busy piece of architecture is easy to do. And a very busy piece of architecture is easy to do if it's hardly repetitive.
Yeah.
It's much more work.
I think Dina and then Zach.
It's probably what I'm going to say is already very much implied in the proposal and in what has been discussed here. But maybe it would be interesting, for some of us to make the point about developing their imagination of the engineers more kind of explicitly in the proposal. And what in particular I'm thinking about is that engineers used to use very many metaphors that originated in science fiction. And I wonder if, especially for the master program, we could think about including some, course on metaphors which travel from science fiction to their real world.
Kathy, haven't you taught a class like that? Maybe when you were first here.
Well, I did teach a class that looked at the history of science through the biographies of scientists, and I actually asked quite a bit of the students, and they were mostly, I think they were in large part engineering students. It was a large class, and there were some LMC students and stack majors, but there were a lot of engineers there, and so we started with Darwin, and went through Lisa Meitner, who was the physicist who discovered that, or determined that nuclear fission was possible and that a nuclear bomb was possible. She was a scientist who got her degree in physics at around the early 20th century, which was amazing, and had her own lab at Kaiser Wilhelm Institute eventually, and had to flee from the Nazis eventually. And we went on to study radar through Tuxedo Park. This is Alfred Loomis, who was connected with business, science, and government during the 20s and 30s. He was a wealthy man. And so yes, I did that just in terms of the real world. We did Feynman, essays by Freeman Dyson, all kinds of visionaries, futurists, and those who worked and ended up with consciousness, Kandel's In Search of Memory, which is a huge new field of research, consciousness research. So yeah, and then that a lot of there's all kinds of cross currents in all of those disciplines in physics, evolutionary science, and lately ecology is a big thing in science fiction too.
Yeah, I thought that probably you have to make your kind of systematic course, like connecting the history of those developments might be.
Yeah, that's a great idea. That would be a lot of fun.
Si, you had
Si,
a
yeah.
comment?
Yeah, it actually sort of follows up on what Kathleen just said, what she said earlier, and that is about fiction, and that is about science and technology. Not necessarily futuristic or learning. There was a period in the 1960s when I was a student that finally significant where Soviet militarized dominated what I was doing. I got very, very interested in the world of working morality and all sorts of issues. In working as a scientist or an engineer for security dominated state. And there were some wonderful things that influenced me very much at the time. It just came out when I was a student, and I'll mention one in particular that I still cite in various ways today, and that's Solzhenitsyn's First Circle. Which is a truly marvelous book if you have enough time to and all kinds of issues about people working under terrible stress. And many times we feel like that the moral decisions and consequences. So and you can look at what used to be science fiction and we are 1984 question.
Yeah.
What has become of what
Yeah.
those two do. But I just like to mention that sort of a different group of
Yeah.
fiction about science.
Other comments, concerns, interests, fan raves or anything like that? No.
Thank you again very much.
And
All right.
thank you all for coming.